give folks some time to sign on. For folks just logging in, we're going to get started in just a minute. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's panel on juvenile justice. My name is Bilal Tajuddin. I'm a Waterbury resident and a community organizer, and it is my pleasure to be tonight's moderator. I am joined by an exceptional panel, and with respect to their time, I'm going to introduce them now. And as the evening progresses, we'll learn all about who they are and how they come to this conversation. We have Charneil Bush, a Democratic candidate for state Senate in Connecticut's 15th district, covering Waterbury, Naugatuck, and Middlebury. Liz Bullard, a licensed professional counselor with E. Bullard Counseling. Claudine Fox, the Public Policy and Advocacy Director at the ACLU Connecticut. Christina Quaranta, the Executive Director of the Connecticut Justice Alliance. Brittany Lamar, a Justice Advisor also with the Connecticut Justice Alliance. And Kenneth Barone, the Associate Director of the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at UConn. As many folks know, juvenile justice has picked up a lot of steam as a major discussion in Connecticut, particularly as it relates to car theft. Tune into the comment sections on news sites or social media posts, and you'll see all sorts of comments calling for stricter, harsher punishments and claims that young people only get a, quote, slap on the wrist. And we're here tonight to unpack and explore some of that context and history of Connecticut's juvenile justice system. Our ground rules for this panel are simple. While there will only be one speaker at a time, our panelists will use the raise hand feature when they have something to add, and I will direct questions and prompts as we go. As this panel has been organized by Charneil, I'm going to offer the first question to him. So Charneil, what are some of the things you've heard in the ongoing conversations around juvenile justice that have you concerned?
Okay. Well, first off, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. One of the reasons why I threw my hat in the ring this election cycle is because of the what I believe to be harmful narratives around our youth here in Connecticut. I think that we have to be mindful of where they are in development and how they're still kind of exploring the world as it gets bigger for them. And so hearing them be characterized as criminals or deviants or dangerous, I think it's just harmful to their growth. And I think that if we want community, if we want to build community, our youth need to be in the community, growing in community and healing community. And so it's why I'm here. It's why I've invited everybody else here.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of narratives going around. And actually, to that point of how the narratives can impact young people, Liz, I want to go to you and ask sort of the same question. As a counselor, what are the things you're hearing about how we're framing young people that have you concerned?
Absolutely. So good evening, everyone. My name is Liz. So as a mental health professional and not we'll say in the juvenile justice space doing that work, what had me concerned was that narrative, right? So we heard a lot of crime with youth has increased and it's highest that it's ever been, right? And then upon doing my own research, you find that the numbers aren't actually true, right? It's actually still lower, and we saw a correlation with the pandemic and an increase in behaviors, which, right, no duh, right? We all went through a trauma. We're not going to function the same way. So yeah, we're going to see this increase. And the narrative wasn't reflecting that. It wasn't reflecting that, hey, we have this stressful situation, we have this break in routine, and are these behaviors in a correlation? It was more of youth are bad today and they need to be locked up. And that oversimplification had me concerned and saying like, hey, we need to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, young people are they're receiving all of these messages, right? And they're hearing a lot about what's being called this juvenile justice system. And we know that it's incredibly complex. And so, Claudine, I want to ask you sort of, why is there a separate justice system for young people versus adults? And what are the reasons we have that, and how is it operating?
I actually think Christina might be better off answering this question, to be honest, because her foot is like, both her feet are knee deep in that. I could take an educated guess to say that it may be because there was at some point in time some recognition that youth operate with capacities that are different from adults, and so the system was initially maybe intentionally built to address the fact that youth are growing still. But at the end of the day, it's still a system of harm, regardless if you're a youth or an adult. So I kind of stand on that standpoint of like, neither of them should exist in the first place. But I'll kick it to Christina, who can talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts.
Please.
Claudine has it right. Absolutely. There's a reason why there's a juvenile justice system and then a separate one for folks over 18, because brains are not fully developed. And we can argue, and research showed us that brains are not even fully developed at 18 when we decide to cut people off and treat them as adults, right? Or in Connecticut, we even have young people charged as adults as young as 15, depending on the charge, and perhaps even the ultimate sentence. So the intention with the juvenile justice system is supposed to be a space for rehabilitation, where you can go and sort of get your needs met that weren't met in the community, and to hold you accountable or to hold yourself accountable. Whether or not that happens in the juvenile justice system is debatable. And same goes for folks in the adult legal system.
Well, so Christina, if I could ask you a follow-up question. So, a young person does something, right, and gets arrested. And so as part of that system where you're saying that there's an attempt to rehabilitate or provide services, what does that process look like after a young person gets arrested?
Sure. And we have something posted on our website, ctja.org, that comes right out of the judicial branch. It's a flow chart. I'm looking at it on my other screen. If folks have questions about what exactly happens, I'll paste it into the chat, because I know the narrative is that nothing happens, and young people are not held accountable, or they are unable to hold themselves accountable, right? And there's actually a lot that happens. Once you have some type of police action, there's a warning given. There might be diversion depending on what it is that you have done or are accused of doing, right? Which is you don't have a record. There's some things that you have to complete. And if it is all completed as agreed to, you can kind of move on with your life, and we can forget that happened, right? You repair the harm and move on. There's an order to detain a young person, or you could have a release and a summons issued for you. So there's a bunch of different steps listed on this, if folks wanted to look at that. And then if they have any questions, they could contact me. We could talk about it. But there's a lot of pieces that happen once a young person is arrested, and there's a lot of disruption to, I think, both their lives, families' lives. And for us at the Justice Alliance, we really ask, like, was that really necessary? And even if you look at young people that are inside of the Department of Corrections now, inside of Nansen Youth Institute, most of them, like let's say 45 out of the 50 young men there are there pre-trial. So they don't have a sentence, right? So they are just there waiting to figure out what's going on. And we could argue, like, do they need to actually be there? Could services be better given to them in the community since they don't get it there? That would be something that I give people to think about now. Like, does that person actually need to be behind bars, or could they be in the community benefiting from something until they are being sort of sentenced for what may or may not have happened?
Yeah, thank you. Ken, I see your hand is raised. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's just important to put into context. There seems to be some assumption in some of the narrative out there that certain youthful offenders would be better equipped in the adult criminal justice system, right? Move their cases to adult criminal court. I think that when I hear that, it's largely because people don't understand the services that are offered in the juvenile justice system. And you are likely going to get far more services and attention as a juvenile in the juvenile system than you are as a juvenile in the adult system. So just to put it in context, our adult courts are often overwhelmed with cases. Okay. And let's take an auto theft, for example, just as an example. Auto theft is still considered a property crime. Now, an auto theft is not the same thing as a carjacking, right? That involves that's classified as a violent offense with somebody in the vehicle. We're talking about, right, somebody stealing an unoccupied vehicle. It's a property crime, which means in adult court, it's going to get treated like a property crime. And the odds are, in fact, we know of the, on average, 90,000 or so arrests a year, a lot of them are property crimes, and they get us disposed of with accelerated rehab. They get exposed of with, maybe you did some pre-sentence while you're waiting to go to the court and it's okay, time served. But the point being, prosecutors are overwhelmed in the adult court and they're moving through these cases quickly. And when it's a low-level property crime, they're not spending a lot of time on it. They have to spend more time on the violent offenses. So this idea that somehow a juvenile moving to the adult court for property offenses, again, I'm not saying that to be controversial. I'm saying that because that's how we classify it across this country, not just in Connecticut. To think that they're going to get more services in the adult court, I think, to me, means that there's a significant lack of understanding of what both of these systems offer. And the difference between the adult court and the juvenile court is that when you get arrested as an adult, you appear back in court where the offense occurred. So let's say I committed a crime in New Britain, I go to the New Britain GA district. Now a juvenile, one of the big differences in the juvenile court is you go to court where you live, not based on where the offense is. So that the juvenile court and the juvenile judge can offer you services and offer the appropriate, ramification, I don't know if that's the right word, but the appropriate services, we'll say, for your particular crime, where you are going to most likely be most of the time. So there are unique differences between the system, and somehow thinking that taking these juveniles and moving them to adult court will solve our problem tells me that some folks don't understand the differences that these systems offer.
Yeah, and so both of you, Ken and Christina, you both said something that I want to touch on. So as this is a panel, and our goal really is to shed some light and some community education on what these things mean. Christina, you mentioned that in Manson, some of the young people there are there pre-trial. Could you explain a little bit about what that means to have a young person at Manson pre-trial, and what are the implications of that for them?
I can. So lots of the young men, and let's not forget about the young women who are in New York Correctional as well, unsentenced pre-trial. We can use both of those terms interchangeably, I think, yes. So until you have gone before a judge and have been found guilty or not guilty of whatever you were arrested for, right, you are being held pre-trial with a charge inside of a prison. And if you're under 18, charged as an adult in Connecticut, it's Manson Youth or it's your correctional. As a pre-trial young person, you do not have to necessarily get any services. You don't necessarily have to go to school. So young people are sitting there spending 24 hours a day inside of a prison, sometimes 23 hours a day inside of their cell without coming out. For what? No one's been found guilty for long periods of time sitting there, right? And what does that do to a young person? That is not any type of speedy trial. I'm copy pasting. I think we should highlight, I say it everywhere I go now. Manson Youth was just found by the United States Department of Justice to violate young people's constitutional rights in December of 2021 for use of solitary confinement, zero mental health intervention inside of Manson, and not following special education rules, right? So what is that really doing for someone if we're torturing them inside of prison? They haven't been found guilty yet. What does that make us as people in Connecticut, and what better is that doing for them, right? So a period of time has to pass. They have to go before a judge, be found guilty, and then they have to complete some type of programming and go to school and all of that. But all of that time before that is sort of not necessarily dead time, but in a way of bettering the person. You're not getting that. You're arguably doing more harm.
I think just to add to sort of the educational component of the system, there's a lot of rhetoric out there about the fact that, right, there's no consequences for juveniles, there's no facilities for juveniles. I want to be clear, I'm not advocating one way or the other, right? I'm a policy person. I look at data and numbers and I just try and assess that. But we have a number of facilities in this state that are lockup facilities, for lack of a better term, for young people under the age of 18. We have a number of confined facilities that are run by essentially juvenile probation. So don't be misled when you hear some folks out there saying, all kids get are probation. Well, you could be under the jurisdiction of probation, but you're technically in a confined facility in either, say, Bridgeport or Hartford, as an example. We also have the two prisons, right? Manson Youth and York Correctional, where young youthful women are as lockup facilities for serious offenses. And when CJTS is open, as the Connecticut Juvenile Training School, it's important to know that it costs on average about $400,000 per child per year. The average stay of a young individual was less than 6 months, right? So this idea, again, that we need facilities to lock people up for long periods of time. Before we closed this facility, it had very few individuals in it. The costs were enormous, and they're always going back out into the community, and we know this. And so currently, less than half of our detention beds are filled in the state. So again, the rhetoric out there talking about we need to build a facility to lock young people, I just look and go, what are you talking about? There's beds, there are facilities that are locked and confined, they're run by different entities, but if you're hearing that, that tells me that you're really selling something else, right? Which is mostly built, I think, based on fear and not based on reality that there's a need for any of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Claudine, I see your hand is up, please.
It happened to me, y'all. Ken started saying exactly what I was going to lead into is, a lot of good policy should be based on facts and figures and what's actually happening in front of us. And a lot of the proposals we've been seeing this session, and honestly, every year since the movement of decarceration and to end mass incarceration really got traction in Connecticut, is this notion that people who commit crimes are awful humans and should be locked away from society, regardless of what it is that they did or however long they're going to be gone. When the reality is, like Ken said, 95% of people that go to prison come home and come back to their communities, but are now saddled with all of these collateral consequences of trying to reintegrate back into the lives that were devastatingly put on pause, not just for them, but for their family members, right? And so the more you hear this rhetoric, the more you have to question, what is it and who are we really talking about? And what are y'all actually trying to say about the people that have been accused of whatever was happening with car thefts this summer? It's not to gaslight and say people didn't have their property taken from them, because that can be devastating, right? But then it also is what are you actually trying to say about us, and what is it that you're trying to do? And so I appreciate Ken and Christina for all of the maneuvering that they have to do around the facts and the rhetoric, and try and stay grounded in that conversation to make sure that we don't get caught up in the gaslighting hurricane that happens every day.
I feel like the gaslighting hurricane could be a great title for how we've been experiencing what's going on with youth incarceration. I want to take an opportunity, Brittany, to get you in. And so you're a justice advisor with Christina. Could you tell us a little bit about what a justice advisor is and what maybe your take on some of this is?
Right. So a justice advisor is really, we're individuals with either first or secondhand direct experience and directly impacted by the system. So whether we've gone through it, probation, incarceration, supervision, whatever it may be, we've been through the system. And so the Alliance has given space for the youth voices like mine and for others to kind of have our voices heard and to bring that perspective of what is it actually like to go through the system. I mean, there's a lot of talk, whether it be through policymakers or other individuals, in regards to what the system maybe is intended to serve, like what's its intended purpose is. But there's a lot of young people out there like myself and individuals who can really speak on what the system actually does, the collateral consequences that come along with it, what it actually feels like, and what the lived experience is within one of those facilities, a locked facility, or what types of services are actually available on probation. What are those encounters like? So to kind of bring that real perspective to the conversation, that is extremely important to have when we're crafting any sort of policies that are going to directly impact people other than the people making the policies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, so policy is obviously a big part of this conversation, right? Because when young people are entering into these systems, that's what they're entering into the effect of, is the policy and what people have decided. So as a follow-up, Brittany, what do you feel are the experiences for young people and the services that are being offered for them in or out of prison or lockup facilities, or even post-release?
Well, I can speak for myself and just, and kind of in general, but I mean, for young people or all individuals going through the system, there's really, I would say a general lack of support. And a lot of that, especially for young people, and if we get to like the lack of services and programs offered, there's just a lack of reinvestment into communities. If I'm, let out of a facility, but there aren't those wraparound services. And in fact, going through the system itself has inflicted more sort of trauma and barriers on my life. And now I'm left alone to navigate that, with a probation officer that checks in with me once a month, but really left to my own devices to try and get back on my feet, when I'm already 10 steps behind. It can be a little difficult. And especially if I'm going back into a community or a home that was sort of damaging to begin with, or didn't have the supports to begin with. Without having fixed like the environment or the community or, the root issues that kind of led to me being introduced to the system or creating or whatnot, without having addressed the root issues, the problem still persists and things are not, the issues aren't fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Claudine, I think you were feeling that, right?
Yeah, because again, what are we actually talking about? And why do we keep blaming folks living in poverty or people being marginalized by systems for being marginalized by systems? And our solution is to put them in prison and forget to forget that they're there or something, and say that solve the problem, or invest more money in over policing, or invest more money in the Department of Corrections, where in actuality, we should really be focusing on investing money in communities, like Brittany was just talking about, investing money in families and making sure families don't have to work 3, 4, 5 jobs to survive, or that oftentimes people resort to crime because it's for survival at that point, right? So I don't know. I think people are just sometimes scared to ask and do the due diligence of answering those big questions. And we keep seeing the result being, I don't know, the people that we work with every day. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. And so there's a lot to be said too, to your point and to Brittany's point about how we view young people, right, as full individuals that are not just a single issue, or you fix this one piece and everything falls back into place. And so actually, Charneil, I want to go to you. As you've been campaigning now and you're out talking to folks and you're meeting families and you have your own experiences, what are some of the gaps that you are seeing? I'm gonna say with our Waterbury residents, our Naugatuck residents, our Middlebury residents, sort of in that 15th Senate district.
mute myself here. So yeah, I mean, the conversations that I've been having are really reflective of what Brittany and Claudine are saying. I think a lot of what I've gotten from residents is that a lot of our representatives, elected officials, people in higher offices aren't necessarily tough on crime as much as they want to be tough on criminals, where they want to like over punish and harbor like deeper consequences, as opposed to actually attacking the factors that contribute to crime, which would be being tough on crime. So doing things like Claudine said, where parents can actually be in the home and do more than just provide, but actually nurture their children, right? Instead of disrupting their home by removing their kids, and then, or finding a way to try to hold parents accountable. I see a lot of parents concerned about education opportunities and after school opportunities for their young people. It's because there's not much to do around here unless you play sports, and not every child is athletic, right? Some children need other means to express themselves, to build community. The other issue that seems to be kind of popping up here is a lack of artistic outlets for them. And we see little things popping up every so often to give kids those things to do, again, to build community. I grew up in a time where there was a lot of investment in arts. I grew up in the 90s. I'm dating myself a bit, but it was a time where you were allowed to lean in to painting or drawing, filming and things like that. Like YouTube and TikTok weren't there when I was a kid, but it was something that you could do to build together. The other thing that I would say, just specifically kind of about the 15th district, is job opportunities for our teens to build skills. Those jobs are no longer available. Those part-time jobs where they can learn how to collaborate with other folks, learn transferable skills that they can bring as they transition to adulthood, are few and far between now. And parents are just concerned. There's this real feeling of foreshortened future and these really dangerous narratives around their kids when they're already fighting. They feel like they're already stuck between a rock and a hard place, are making them feel like the 15th district isn't the place where they can raise their kids safely.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many conflicting pieces of information. And when I worked with youth and funding educational programs, there was this sort of renaissance when people decided that, oh, if a young person is not doing well in school, maybe they're hungry. And this was like a groundbreaking idea that young people are affected by their circumstances. And so there's a lot of research done into how do they better support young people in early mornings and start times and food and nutrition and housing. And so there's a lot of that good information out there. And I want to go to Ken, actually. Ken, if you want to share some of your research and data from your position on what's going on nationally in Connecticut, what trends you're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's just really important to sort of frame the reality of what's happening from a 30,000 foot view. And I think to go to, I think what some of the other panelists said before, this isn't to try to discount individuals' personal experiences with crime. Crime is real. Crime does occur. Crime is something that has existed as long as man has existed, and is something that policymakers for a long time have tried to figure out the best solutions to. That being said, crime is still at a relatively historic low across all categories of crime in the way we measure it. Let's take the one that seems to get the most attention in the last few years, auto theft. 2019, we had the fewest number of auto thefts ever recorded in Connecticut since we started reporting this data over 30 years ago. Okay, fewest number, right before the pandemic. And you know what's really fascinating? The first quarter of 2020, January, February, March, we got hit with the pandemic, remember, about March 15th of 2020. The first quarter of 2020, we were on pace to see an even lower rate of auto thefts than the year prior, which was a historic low. Now, to put it in context, 2019, we had about 6,000 auto thefts across the state. The peak in Connecticut was in 1991 with almost 27,000 auto thefts. Okay. We averaged almost 20,000 auto thefts a year through the 1990s. And we averaged 12,000 car thefts a year through most of the early 2000s. By 2019, that was half of what it was just a decade prior. Now, April of 2020 is when we started to experience an increase in auto thefts and other property crimes. which is interesting. I don't know, I'm saying this sort of facetiously, what happened in April of 2020. But I think there was something that happened, not just here in Connecticut, but across the country, that may have had a direct correlation on the increase in crime, in that particular category of crime. Now, what's interesting is not only did the state of Connecticut experience this increase in auto thefts, and the auto thefts and the other crime category was homicide. Believe it or not, Connecticut was one of only 4 states in 2020 that actually saw a decrease in violent crime. Although, right, homicide is a category within violent crime, but violent crime in general is down 4%, which bucked the trend nationally. And it didn't matter whether you were a red state or a blue state or from a big city or a small suburban town, you experienced crime, particularly in those 2 categories, at a higher rate in 2020 than you did in 2019. And so, you know, we did see an uptick in auto thefts in 2020, but guess what? It was nowhere near where we saw auto theft even 15 years ago. Certainly not what we saw in the 1990s. We are not what would be deemed, I think, historically speaking, in a crime wave. And the numbers that we've seen from 2021 show that as the pandemic started to recede and life started to open back up and juvenile services were starting to be offered again, for example, that crime started to slowly come back down. And so I think we can expect to see in 2021, based on the data that we've reviewed, that we won't be back to those 2019 levels. We are still dealing with a once in a century, right? We have to put this in context. We dealt with a once in a century global pandemic. And what we saw was an uptick in some crime categories that was akin to about 2015 levels, right? I mean, but we are treating it as if we are back to the days of the rhetoric with super predators. Right. And the other thing that I think is just really important to know in the context of everything you're hearing, the crime that is most being talked about has a clearance rate. Now, just so you know what that means, that means the rate at which police are able to arrest people, right? Solve the crime. Okay, we know who did it. We arrested you. We can clear that off our books. Auto thefts had a clearance rate in 2020 of 7%. 93% of crimes went unsolved in that category. That's not because police weren't trying to solve crimes, because they're historically really hard crimes to solve. Typically, 90% of all auto thefts go unsolved. Yet all of the rhetoric and all of the policy solutions that we are primarily hearing have to do with a tougher on crime system. And even if as a policymaker, you thought, okay, that's a good idea, as a numbers person, you look and go, okay, well, will that reduce the crime? Well, all of those proposals rely on an arrest, right? Okay, we'll lock them up. We'll throw them in adult court. We'll throw them in adult jails, right? Well, you still need to be arresting people. You're not going to magically start arresting more people tomorrow because you made the crime a bigger penalty for the crime. So we're talking about solutions that will have little to no impact on actually reducing the crime. And actually, we don't have to look very far to know if these tough on crime policies are effective. So the other thing I hear is, well, you know what, it's not about whether or not, somebody will actually be impacted by that increased penalty. It's a deterrence. If they know that these penalties exist, it will scare them into not committing these crimes. Well, it didn't scare them in the 1990s when there was 20,000 plus, and we had tough crimes back then. We don't have to look very far to a tough on crime criminal justice system. And guess what? Crime was a lot worse then than it is today. And the last data point, because I could go on with different data facts for hours, but the last data point is that, we know, well, of all of the individuals that are arrested, and we already talked about how very few people are arrested for, say, auto theft. It's a hard crime to solve. Only about a third are under the age of 18. So again, we still are having this conversation about juveniles driving this crime. We have this horrible juvenile crime problem. 30 years ago, half of all of those arrested, and we arrested far more people for these crimes, were under the age of 18. For the last 15 years, it's been about a third. In 2020, the year of the pandemic, it was still only about a third. 35% of the individuals arrested were under the age of 18, which guess what that means? The majority of people committing these offenses are being arrested for committing these offenses, let me be clear, are already going into the adult criminal justice system. They're adults. Now, a 19-year-old might look young, but if you're 19, you're an adult. If you're 18, you're still an adult in this state. But we could argue whether that's appropriate or not. But the reality is that last year, over 65% of the people arrested for committing an auto theft were adults and went to the adult criminal justice system. And in fact, in 2021, according to Judicial, we arrested 200 fewer juveniles for stealing cars than we did in 2020. And we arrested about 100 fewer juveniles in 2021 than we did in 2019, which was the fewest number of auto thefts we ever had reported in the history of collecting this data in Connecticut. So the data tells a very different story. It doesn't say that there's been no crime increase in 2020. It tells us exactly when it happened. We saw it happening across the entire country. We actually saw it happening across most of Europe as well. We've heard a lot of rhetoric around, well, you know what, maybe this is not just a result of the pandemic, but we passed a big police accountability bill, and that's what drove. Okay, well, the crime started increasing in April. George Floyd was murdered a month later, and then several months later, we passed police accountability. And again, the beautiful thing about this country is that we have 50 states, and they all have their own criminal justice systems. And we don't have to look, we can go to Missouri, for example. While we were in Connecticut passing a police accountability bill, Missouri passed what could arguably be determined the opposite of that, a police officer's bill of rights. And guess what Missouri saw? A far greater number of auto thefts than we did here in Connecticut. Missouri had the fourth national most auto thefts in the country, and Connecticut didn't even register in the top 10, right? So we don't have to look far to know that our policies in Connecticut have been working, and we certainly don't want to reverse back to policies that we know will not have an impact on reducing crime.
Yeah, wow. I mean, if I could have that as my ringtone, I think I probably would, because the number of times I hear throughout a day conflicting narratives is shocking. And I want to sort of bounce between those really exceptional facts and figures, right? Where it's plain as day that narratives and facts can vary, right? And I want to sort of temper that with a conversation on what are the impacts of those narratives, and what does it mean when so many aspects of our society, right, through law enforcement to the court systems to our neighbors and our friends and our family are all saying the same thing. So Liz, I want to address this question to you again as a mental health professional, right? So you're not in the facts and figures land. You're the person who is helping clear up some of this with the young people who are hearing day in and day out that they are a danger or a threat or a trouble to their neighbors and their friends. What do you think of as a messaging or a guide that we could share with young people about how they are?
Absolutely. I love that. So kind of thinking about in terms of bias or stereotype, right? So if you, as the adult person, have this framework of, oh my gosh, I'm so terrified of this young person, you're going to be terrified when it comes to helping that person or when you're in the environment, right? So then your behavior is not going to be that friendly, right? So whether you're talking about body language, tone, all of that, right? You bring that to the space, right? So when the young person kind of feeds back on that energy and they're just like, well, I don't like you. Now you are immediately, right? We have this narrative of like, okay, we're going to go back and forth. Right. So if we kind of step back and say, I'm just going to show up, right? I'm just going to show up and be in support or in this space with this person, right? I'm going to leave bias at the door. you can see the person, you can have the conversation of what's going on here, right? You're not bringing in all this stuff. So I think that's kind of like number one. Number two, when youth are seeing this narrative of they're so bad, they're this, right? All these negative things, you can start to internalize that, right? You can start to feel, well, like, okay, why try? I'm just bad, right? Why do anything? I'm not this good person. I can't achieve that. So I think the narrative is very important because we don't want youth to start internalizing that and feel like they do not have these opportunities to succeed. And I think a lot of times what I hear is like, well, we want youth to be accountable. We want youth to fix their mistakes, right? That's all great if that's what the system is doing, but it's not, right? So we're not giving, I believe Christina, when she first talked about like that repair, right? Repair is important, and that's not what the current system is doing. We have this fear or this punishment lens, which again, is not doing anything to help youth. Who, again, I think maybe Claudine had mentioned this might be going because it's a safety aspect, right? I might have to steal because I do not have food, or I need to do this because everyone else is doing this. And if I don't, my life or my family's life might be in jeopardy, right? So I think having some awareness of youth, some of the big problems that they are facing, I think that if I can nail down, like, youth are facing a lot of things that I think a lot of adults would do poorly to deal with. So just being aware of, like, these are kids and kids have feelings and they're learning with the skills that they have. And it's our job to teach them and to be sensitive and having that repair mindset of, I'm going to help you repair this. And that might mean consequence, but we're going to repair this because we are working in community with each other. So that's my long-winded answer to answer your question.
Yeah. Well, I want to draw into some. We have an active chat here on our Zoom log. I want to draw in something that someone made a comment about, saying that there's a big difference in Connecticut that we doesn't properly fund harm reduction, right? It relies on nonprofits to foot the bill, and that kind of concept, right? That we are creating a problem with one system and then relying on a different system that doesn't share those resources to then create the system of repair, right? And I, so Liz, to your point exactly, Brittany, to some of what you were saying earlier, anyone can answer this question if it feels relevant to you. How do we bridge these two things, right? A system that harms and says, I am here to repair, and then, but there's also this other system over here trying to do other repair work. How does a young person or a family navigate 3, 4, 5 different systems all saying, we're here to help?
I think about this a lot, right? Like, and I think it's the lens of America is a very individualistic society, and we have this tendency to operate in silos and not recognize that everything is actually connected to each other as much as we don't want it to be connected. And, while like the ACLU focuses on a lot of different issue areas, the criminal legal system has become incredibly important to us, and something that I've recognized and have been talking about with like community partners like Ken and Christina and other folks is this idea that like the criminal legal system is born out of the failure of all of the other systems, and how do we like accurately reconcile that in a way that recognizes housing. Did I freeze? Oh, okay.
For a second, but you're back.
Okay, cool. The failure of our housing system, the failure of our public education system, the failures of our food security system, healthcare, employment that actually pays people more than the minimum wage and recognizes a living wage and what a living wage actually means in Connecticut, right? Like, those are all of the solutions that need to happen in order for us to actually reduce the harm that's happening in our communities. And we far too often focus on individuals as like the creator of harm. And yes, there is a such thing as like person to person harm, but what does it look like when we actually look at the context of which in which people are existing, and the systems that then force the harm to happen on an individualistic level. And I don't think it's on the families actively trying to navigate these systems every single day to figure it out, right? I think it is on the people that we have elected into power and the people that are sitting at those powerful tables, to be able to recognize the context in which families and my family, all of y'all's families, right? And like, not be so like this cognitive dissonance that happens where it's like, I'm not a part of this. Yeah, I could rant about this forever, but I think we spend too much time forcing families and individuals to fix something that is a lot bigger than them. And then instead, because the systems aren't being fixed, we then punish them and invest in over policing of Black and Brown communities, which is going to be the solution to this, right? If opposition doesn't get what they want based on like increasing penalties for juvenile justice stuff, we're just going to see them course correct and invest in police and policing of Black and Brown communities, which is going to put people in contact with the criminal legal system anyways, right? So if we don't actually start taking that hard look and forcing people in power to take that hard look with us, we're all going to be asked out. Excuse my language. Sorry. I made it this far without swearing.
No worries. Yeah, I was at a neighborhood association meeting a couple of months ago, and every meeting has a report out by a community relations officer who tells us about any particular stats or figures that are going on in the neighborhood. And I was a little bit surprised to hear the community relations officer was advocating for neighborhood residents to chime in against police reform or police accountability measures so that police can protect property, to Ken's point earlier, to protect your individual pieces of property, which was kind of a jarring thing to hear in a narrative way, in a neighborly kind of setting, to say that, well, we need more rain, right? We need more power in order to make sure that these things don't happen in your neighborhood.
I guess I would ask them, what specifically in the bill prevents you from protecting somebody's property from a criminal? Nothing. Zippo, right. Zero, zilch. I've read the entire bill several times. There is now, they'll play on a whole bunch of things, right? Which is, well, I'll be more liable if I know you won't be, right? There's a lot of misinformation around that bill, but and I think the unfortunate thing is that the rhetoric that you're talking about, it appeals to one specific group of people, and they are the people that will determine the outcome of elections in Connecticut, at least in the short future. And those are people that look like me and tend to live in communities where I grew up in, right? So that's what this is appealing to. The Waterbury and the Waterbury area is an interesting community because it tends to buck the trend of where we see other small to medium-sized cities in terms of how they respond to crime. We certainly see much different strategies in responding to crime in, say, New Haven, Bridgeport, and Hartford. I'm not saying that they're perfect in doing everything right, but I am saying their strategies are different, and they tend to be forced to be a little bit more thoughtful and progressive about their strategies. And Waterbury's always had a much different approach to these topics.
I appreciate, Ken, the delicate dance around that. And as a Waterbury resident, I'm happy to say that we are backwards in a lot of our policies and practices. I've got no problem saying that. And Liz, I saw your hand up.
Just real quickly, piggybacking
Please.
off of that, in regards to, police feeling like they can't do their job. The other spectrum of that is the residents saying like they feel unsafe. But I find like when you question people and like, okay, well, has something directly happened to you or to your neighbors? It's like, well, no, I read this. And, I think that's why these conversations and the narrative and the information is important, because when we really talk and think about it, nothing directly has happened to you. And that's not taking away from people who've had things happen to them, because that is scary and that's a trauma in itself. But the proximity is not as real as the perceived fear.
And just a quick quick story, Liz. Last week, I think, or a week before, I did a presentation about the auto theft trends going down in 2021, and different news outlets have covered it. And I do think that's part of the dialogue that's missing. The print media did a better job of trying to be thorough in their reporting, I found. There was one, and I won't name the station, television report that presented, in about a 30-second clip, the trend of motor vehicle thefts are improving in Connecticut, followed by a sensationalized specific incident of a motor vehicle theft that had just occurred previously, and interviewing the victim and how painful it was for them. And again, that person's pain was real, and I understood it. But again, people are seeing, if you're watching your news, on a regular basis, particularly on television, they are seeing a very small clip of, things statistically seem to be getting better. And then they're hearing this long, drawn out 3-minute sensationalized story about a victim of a particular property crime. And that's what they're left feeling like, oh, that could happen to me. I can relate to that person on TV. What data? Oh, yeah, that guy, right? Is kind of wiped away. And so there is an issue, I think, in the way that this has been framed. And the media plays a role in that, and they need to be held accountable.
Yeah, for sure. Christina, I see your hand up. So we'll go to you. And then I want to, as we're nearing the end of our hour, I'm going to ask everyone sort of a general question as we proceed to close.
Thank you. I think something that I have heard everybody hint at, and maybe one of us has said, is that a lot of the problems with proposed policy, the words that people use, is racism. And that's where it all comes from. And I see Gus asking the Q&A here. He asked why elected officials are so focused on villainizing young people. And I almost replied to Gus and put like an asterisk in there and put like villainizing Black and brown young people, because that's who we see behind bars, and that's whose faces and bodies are in handcuffs, right? They have figured out how to work with, treat, rehabilitate white youth, not Black and brown, and that's by a choice. And a good point that Gus also brought up was, why are public officials incapable of imagining policies and systems that haven't worked and have actually caused harm? And I think same thing, because we have figured out what we can do that would be creative and as convenient for folks that live in certain areas of Connecticut and look a certain way, but not for Black and brown youth. And a point that I have made often, because Ken and I kind of follow each other around to these presentations talking about car theft, but there wasn't a big fuss and a big uproar, really. And Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, when there were car thefts in the bigger cities that were mostly made up of Black and brown people, right? But as soon as the car theft shifted on the map, and Ken has a good presentation that shows this, as soon as it went to the smaller suburban, mainly white areas of Connecticut, people were very upset and screaming and hollering. And we're not saying that it doesn't matter because it happened to white people or fewer people, saying that the same energy was not there when it was happening in big cities to Black and brown people. It just wasn't, and that's a fact. And if we don't name racism, it's a problem.
It wasn't a part of the discussion when there were 2,000 car thefts a year in New Haven. Now, New Haven is experiencing about 600 car thefts a year now, right? They're still putting up a large number relative, but they're way down from where they used to be. But, surrounding suburban town maybe experienced 10 a year, and now they're experiencing 25. Right? They maybe experience, some towns, were experiencing 2 or 3, now they're experiencing 12. Well, remember, all of those little towns tend to have their own police department. And now you have police administrators have to deal with a quote unquote 200% increase in auto thefts. Well, yeah, you had 12 last year, and New Haven had 400 fewer, right? So on a whole, we're still down, but your community, and the reason why car thefts have shifted away from the cities and into the suburbs is very simple, because it's not, again, isolated to Connecticut. We've got data across the country that tells us why this is occurring. As the technology changed in vehicles and we moved to key fob cars, we saw a substantial increase in car thefts, with cars being left unlocked and keys being left inside. And those vehicles started to saturate the market in suburban communities more so than they did in cities. And so this is a crime of opportunity. The opportunity increased in suburban communities because people there became comfortable leaving cars unlocked. And that's why we started to see the increase. We could take a massive bite out of this crime tomorrow. Lock your keys, lock your car, take your keys with you. I cannot tell you how many people leave their keys in the cup holder of their car and then the car gets stolen. Do not warm your car up in the gas station while you run in to get gas. Don't leave it running in the parking lot, of the school while you run your kid in. Like, yes, I would personally love to live in a world where we can do that, but we don't, and we never have. It's not like some new thing. Oh my God, now we have to lock our car. No, but it wasn't that easy before. Lock your car, take your keys. And I think Christina's right about sort of why are we hearing so much rhetoric around this today? It's where the problem is, not what the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the idea that people leave things unlocked at all boggles the mind for me. I think I lock the doors inside my own house in different rooms just because, just what you do by habit, right? So as we sort of get now, as we're closing out, and everyone knows that all my doors are well guarded, I want to ask a question to each of us to close. As someone who works really deeply and intentionally in my local Waterbury community and like in my neighborhood, I want to frame my last question as that neighborhood association meeting, right? So we here assembled, I think, are all advocates for young people and for correcting narratives and to making positive change. I'm going to call on you, and when I do, how would you respond in that situation where a piece of misinformation around juvenile justice, juvenile crime, car theft, any sort of these aspects that we've touched on tonight, what would you say to your neighbor who said something that is not entirely true? How would you help, and what piece of information would you spread as the correct, helpful narrative? I'm going to go, Brittany, to you first.
All right. Yeah, Christina, so I was hoping I'd be like third or fourth here, but I'll go first. I think I really try, I have like a 5 of Ken's facts written down that go with me all over. So I can at least ground any conversation in data, although I'm not going to sit there and, spew statistics at people. But I do think it's important that, that we can ground the conversation in reality and what actually exists, without fueling, the false narratives that currently exist in those sorts of conversations. I think that's like my go-to, is just kind of being able to ground that conversation in reality, and trying to shed some light. I don't go around telling my personal story, but I go around shedding light on the types of issues that do plague, marginalized communities or individuals who, don't have all the puzzle pieces in order that maybe some other individuals do. And I try and hone in on possible root issues that maybe other people are dealing with. And I try and humanize individuals in their entirety, rather than just the crimes that they're hearing about. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the humanizing piece is so important, right? Because that's what a regular resident of a town might hear and stick with, right? If the stats might kind of boggle. Liz, what would you say to a neighbor who was misinformed on juvenile justice?
So I'm going to teach you a therapy skill, right? That everybody can do. They're called I statements. So in this situation, I'd use an I statement. So I'd I feel, and right, you would insert emotion, right? So I feel concerned when you present that information because the data shows that, and we've heard all these facts, so insert whatever, right? So because we've heard that youth crime is lower, and when you say that it's higher or whatever the fact is, I feel triggered or not safe because that's not accurate information, or I feel a little sad because youth are important, right? So an I statement, I feel, insert emotion, because, and insert why. So that's what I would do.
That's great. And that's helpful. Way better than what I do, which is, get really heated.
Right. We don't want to be like, you're so wrong. That leads to a different conversation with different words.
Right. Claudine, what would you do in the situation where a neighbor is misinformed on juvenile justice?
I have a tendency to ask a lot of questions, and asking questions to kind of help paint the narrative, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not my responsibility to like back them into making them like come to my side of the argument, but at least asking questions about values and like, well, do you think it's worth it for a kid to get caught up in a system and have their life ruined, even if, you know, a car is replaceable, their future isn't? Like, probably feels a little shamey, but you know, that's kind of where I'm at in these conversations. I can no longer be the bridge, and so I feel I would ask questions like that. But then also that stat that Ken said, 65% of the car thefts that are happening in Connecticut are actually committed by adults, to me should just like end and dead any misinformation. So it depends on the person, it depends on the context of the conversations, but oftentimes I end up asking questions to kind of help people start thinking about like how the lens to how they're approaching whatever they're saying to me. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so helpful, because I hope that folks who are joining us here on Zoom or who are watching on YouTube are getting a sense of how they can help combat these narratives. Ken, to your, I'm really curious on if you had to pick a stat, or how would you respond in these situations, knowing so many quick figures. What would you say to someone who is misinformed, and how would you help?
I usually try and follow based on what piece of information they're using as evidence to support their claim. And if they're not using evidence to support their claim, I'll try and ask them, okay, you know, how did you draw that? What makes you draw that conclusion, right? Well, my neighbor had their car stolen. Okay, I understand that. And then, you know, well, was your neighbor's first? I usually go, well, was your neighbor's car unlocked? Oh yeah, they left the key. Lock your car, right? That's not like 90% of the time that ends the conversation. But typically, it's easier to engage in this conversation from my perspective, and it's a different one because I get paid to spend all day just looking at data and trying to retain this information. Which I know is something that not everybody has the ability to do. So when it comes to this particular crime, it's just trying to separate myth from fact. And a lot of times it's just educating people about the system that currently exists. So many people are surprised to find out that we do have facilities that juveniles can be detained in. Again, I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying people are like, oh, I thought they just released them to their parents. No, depends on the crime. And here, so sometimes it's just a matter of educating. How does the system work? What does the data actually tell us? And then also, you know, I'm a counselor by trade. Did get my master's degree in counseling. So using those active listening skills, as Liz pointed out, always helps in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Christina, what would you do in a situation where someone has misinformation? How would you help course correct and make justice advocates out of us all?
Yeah, this is like my everyday life now. Like Claudine says, it depends on the person and the situation. Lately, I have been bringing facts and some stories that can kind of ground people's mind and heart and get them back to, hey, we're talking about people, we're talking about children. This is what we're talking about. Here's what you're talking about that you want to actually do to them. Why? Claudine's point of questions and trying to just talk to people about it. Because yelling is never really going to get you the outcome that you want, right? Getting frustrated with people. So try to just talk through the stats, try to talk through what we know works and see where I can get with people. Yeah.
That's super helpful. Very, very practical. Charneil, what about you in a situation where someone has the wrong narrative or a piece of misinformation? What would you do to help correct?
See, I knew I was going to go last when that question popped up, and I was like, everyone's saying such awesome things. It makes me but I walk a very particular line as a would-be politician. And so I've actually sat in these neighborhood association meetings when people have said things, and I've heard community relations officers say things that are very much opinion and not fact. And the question I always have, like the last one I sat in was like 3 weeks ago, And I asked them, well, what kids are we talking about? Like, can you describe, when you think of these kids, who are you talking about? And then what is your proximity to them? Like, do you spend time with them? Do you share space with people that are like this? And recognize that this is your community too. And the conversation I've had most recently, specifically around juvenile justice or crime in general, is acknowledging whether or not people know the difference between a safe community and a policed community. And I think what they want is they want their communities to remain safe, meaning that police only show up when things go quote unquote wrong, while communities that look like mine in the Brooklyn section of Waterbury have police officers riding through every 30 seconds. There's someone stopping someone on the street. And I said, well, for us, there's a real trauma for that. When you set up a narrative that people are dangerous, that I saw in the chat that people's property is more important than the futures of our young people, that is what people carry with them. That is what people carry with them in, city halls. That's what they carry with them in the Capitol building. And it sets them up where there is no wraparound services. Brittany talks about what it looks like on the other side of criminalizing kids, and it makes it harder for them to get jobs. They come back to communities that they're not prepared to see the change that's in them. They don't have access to adequate housing. And so there are things that we do and say that actually harm people while we're trying to do the right things by ourselves. But if we really want a community and we really want to secure the future, specifically of the 15th, right? The Waterbury is where this conversation happens a lot. Then we really have to bet on our kids and bet on the fact that we are all hardworking people who want successful futures. And that framework looks different for everybody, but that we all really want to try hard and that we don't want to see these legitimate chances for success or social goals to shrink, but we want to see them grow. And if that means investing in schools, investing in parks, after school programs, businesses, gainful and attainable employment, then we have to do that. And we have to say it with our chest, as opposed to making little Black and brown kids feel like they're bad because they shoplifted from Yankee Candle. I've had these conversations moreover, and it usually works when it becomes well, what do you say? Like, who are these kids and how do you feel about them? And it's been interesting to hear the responses, and it's almost been heartening a lot of times to hear them not maybe come to Jesus, so to speak, but get further away from a narrative and closer to facts.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't know what Yankee Candle you shop at, but those candles are way too big to get into a pocket.
You'd be surprised at what Yankee Candle. So you'd be surprised at what people can do with a big job.
Absolutely. I appreciate all these responses because it's hard, right? It's hard for folks who may not be the most informed, who may not have a day job that lends themselves to this information and these conversations, to say something, right? When someone says something that is inaccurate, it's hard to change those narratives if we're not sure what we're changing them from and what we're changing them to. So I really appreciate all of these tips and tricks. And I think with that, we're a little bit over our hour. I appreciate your time and extending to 7:08. If anyone has any last comments or anything to say, I'll open the floor and then we'll close out. No?
Just thank you for the opportunity. I've learned so much from the people in the room. So thank you for being so open to sharing your expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Seconded. Cool.
I was going to say the same thing. Just thank you to everybody for being smarter than me. I'm not afraid to say that you know more than me, but thank you for sharing who you are, what you are, and why you are with us. And just thank you to everybody who tuned in to learn a little bit more about something that is super important to me and my community.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Monday evening and lock your cars. Take your keys out.